Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Casperless episode of Marketing Corner, where unfortunately I'm not with Casper, but I am with two amazing guests, Beate Steen, from the founder of Rock Consulting and a Verdane GTM advisor, and the man of the hour, Jacco van der Kooij, from Winning by Design, and how I know you of the revenue architecture guy, and fresh off the stage from Sassius. So how are you today, sir?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for having me. It is an absolute pleasure and a treat.
Oh, brilliant. That's great to hear. Thank you so much. So we're going to pin you down. And the first thing we'd love to talk about a little bit today is revenue architecture. The book, the 700-page Bible that a lot of people use. And I wanted to share this information with our portfolio companies we're trying to support at scale, to talk a little bit about where did it come from? Why do you think we need it? How the heck do you do it? Everything and everything in between. So let's start with, where did it come from?
Well, thank you for asking. So what it comes from is the understanding that when organizations grow, they follow a pattern, and that pattern can be mapped and it can be improved by doing the things the way they should be doing. Companies should not fail because they hired the wrong CRO or whether they deployed the wrong GTM. Companies should fail because the product is not the right product or the market is the wrong thing, but not because there was something wrong that went wrong in operations. And today, the success rate of companies is extremely low compared to what we would expect. Companies that are stacked with talent, that are supported by great VC firms, are coached and counseled by some of the best executives. They shouldn't have that low of a success rate.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And I think maybe if we take a couple of steps back, because you're an engineer by trade, I guess, originally, right?
That's right. I'm an engineer, yes.
And so I've listened to a couple of podcasts where you talk about that kind of mindset of having actual measurable sort of points has influenced something that has been, is it safe to say, largely gut-driven for a long time?
Historically, it is gut-driven, but that also is an explanation why the results are so challenging. Being an engineer, I look at things and I'm trying to determine what are the patterns. Now, often what we look at, we think in the form of processes. And process is not perhaps the best way of describing it. What we're looking at is frameworks. The difference between a process and a framework is that in a process, step B follows step A and is followed by step C or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas in a framework, think of that as like, hey, I'm giving certain markers, stay within that, do this, and so on and so forth. And today, what we have to understand is that we operate in a series of frameworks. Mm-hmm. And once we map those frameworks, we can actually quite, with relatively ease, give an explanation of where are we today and where are we going next? Mm-hmm. And I always like to think is, I want to put a finger somewhere on a line and say, you are here with the company right now. You want to get to and then point the finger next on the line and provide a pathway to that. Engineering is a great way to do that. And, like often looking at the way how a bridge gets engineered and go like, look, the Golden Gate Bridge got engineered almost 100 years ago. It has, there's every day 1 million people or something, like a ridiculous amount of people pass. How can an engineer create that 100 years ago? And why can we not engineer and design a company properly today? I believe that is that we could tackle that, and revenue architecture is my attempt to do that.
And I also love this concept of winning by design. Usually it's not luck. Right. And maybe sometimes it feels like it's luck and a real man makes his own luck. Right. The Titanic quote for all the millennials out there. But I love that by design, like we designed this. We did this intentionally. We followed these steps. And I think that's something that's really important, but missing in so many organizations is what steps do we follow? What do we look at? What do we optimize? And we've spoken a little bit about the bow tie. I think the bow tie it reframed how I look at marketing entirely. But I think, talk to us a little bit about maybe, would you say GTM can be very chaotic and this is trying to bring order to the chaos? Or how do you think that this is helping people get to win, to design their win?
First of all, I want people to understand what is going on.
Yes.
I want them just to learn, and not feel that this has to be chaos. Chaos can be in the execution. Chaos can be in the market. Chaos can be because new technology like AI comes out, right? But then I want you to understand, where are you in that chaos, right? And the understanding, once people understand, so many problems start to disappear simply because they now, understand why. And most things that we experience can be completely explained why they are happening and how they are happening. Mm-hmm. The reason why design, what you mentioned, is so important, what you mentioned earlier, is if you design something and something goes wrong, you can say, I designed it to do this, but then it went wrong. You can see the delta. But if you never designed anything and you just go about your business, then you don't know what you did wrong and where you went wrong, because you're just shooting from the hip. I have to say, having now done this for 15 years and dealing with some of the fastest growing companies in the world, many are operating well over $1 billion in revenue. It is an absolutely, mind-boggling thing for me to see that what has happened over the past 15 years. Over the past 15 years, companies that grew to 1 million use the exact same approach to grow to 10 million, use the exact same approach to grow to 100 million, use the exact same approach to grow to 1 billion. And wherever you are along the line, and whenever we assist companies in that journey, it's the same problem. And it's coming from what we nowadays know as the growth at all cost mindset, that in absence of a proper design has by default becomes the habits that the humans have formed. And as a result, we're dealing with much of the stress points that we experience today.
Interesting. And you mentioned a couple of times about like the human body and approaching things like a doctor looking at a human body. So every body is different, yes, but ultimately underneath it's the same. And is this what you're seeing in these companies?
That's right. Well, what I found is there is a need for 6 models. Today we know 6 models. Like the same way that when we look at a human body, and to the point that you made, is every human body has the same amount of bones, right? Like and if I get the picture of a skeleton, I don't have a complete picture. Now the skeleton is a model of the bone structure of a human being. In order to make sure that I understand how a human propels, I also need to know what the muscular structure is. So if I overlay the muscular structure on top of the bone structure, 2 different models, I get a more accurate picture. Each model on its own is super accurate, but it doesn't give me an idea on what the human body works. Same way in growth, we have a series of models. You have a growth model that tells us where are you on your growth and the trajectory you're following. You have a GTM model that explains to us what particular go-to-market motion you're using. We're having a data model that tells us what are you measuring. Because, for example, an ownership-driven business that is based on a perpetual upfront software cost works in a different way than a recurring revenue business on a subscription or a recurring revenue business on a consumption-based model. So all these businesses have different approaches that can be modeled inside a framework. And once you put all the frameworks together, you get a reasonably accurate picture on how companies grow from 1 million to 10 billion.
Brilliant. And I guess, how do we start that journey? And I guess maybe the starting point for us is you've been brought in to help a company. What's the first thing that you do, and what's the first thing that they do to get on this path of designing their success, as opposed to just hitting and hoping and just we're going to get there someday?
Yes. The best way for executives often is first way is education. But let's say that that has taken place. That they go like, okay, I'm interested to learn more. Data is the way to go. So the first place that we always start is the model that we call a data model, which is popularized in the form of the Bowtie. And then we sort of like, hey, let's map your data so we get a proper feeling, right, of what's going on. Now, historically, there is a reasonable data model on what we call the left side on the funnel, or the acquisition-based approach. But there's often a very immature model on the customer retention and expansion level, where actually most of the growth occurs and where actually most of the challenges take place and the opportunities are. So the first thing we do is establish a proper proper data model. Now, to give you an idea what that means, that doesn't mean that we just look at your data and go like, okay, give us your data and so on and so forth. No. What we do is we structure a business in what we call growth GTM motion. So think of one GTM motion as I have an SMB motion, or I have an enterprise motion, or I have a PLG motion. And I'm using names that are not necessarily standardized, but that are very common sense, right? Like we standardize those names differently, but let's say a PLG motion or an enterprise motion. That to us becomes a form of a revenue production line. Okay, now I can give you the listener a very simple understanding. Once I say my enterprise motion is a revenue production line, I can go as like, oh, well, it has inputs, leads, and throughput, conversion rates. So suddenly the structure of just thinking about it as a revenue production line starts giving me a clear picture on what I do. Now I overlay the data model. I go like, okay, how many leads did I get in? And how many wins did I get from that? Okay, that's a throughput metric. Now, to give you an idea, when a company starts early on, they're super input centered because there's plenty of opportunity. If you're at $500,000, look at the world. You got an enormous amount of opportunities. And as you're grabbing all that green field, you're very input focused. Right. Now, when the inputs stop flowing in, the lead flow is not that, like you mature, then you slowly but surely start to become very throughput focused. You look at conversion rates. Oh, if I have 1,000 leads a week, I'm not going to be worried about conversion rate. I just want to get the best leads as quickly as possible. But if I only have 10 leads a week and I need 5 opportunities, I'm going to be very throughput focused. Simple minds, the simple step of looking at your data and structuring that in the different GTM motions creates already a very simplistic approach of like, okay, where are you? Are you input focused or are you throughput focused? What is the maturity of that? And slowly but surely, this complex thing that we call growth starts to unravel and start to create patterns that we can recognize and that we can improve.
Excellent. And maybe I have 2 questions about that.
Sure.
And you can answer them in whatever order makes sense for you. 1, what about having really bad data? Because a lot of the companies I encounter have not been great at tracking this. And 2, who owns this? Because I could be a marketer who is 100% bought into this, but my targets, my setup, my team, my resources, all of those things are sometimes out of my control, and that can also inhibit my ability to adopt this throughout the company. How do you overcome those 2 obstacles?
First of all, bad data there are different forms of bad data. So, we can determine bad data as an absence of data. I don't have the data. Bad data could be, marketing has one side of data and what they call an MQL, and sales has another idea of what an MQL and SQL is, right? So
very common.
Very common, right? Now, the latter one can be relatively easily adjusted because you establish a data structure. So the data model says, oh, I have stages, or I have lead generation and lead development and so on. Creates a certain approach that we can look at stages. Data structure gives us an idea, oh, I'm calling an MQL and an SQL, I call that in the mid-market, but the enterprise market may refer to that as an opportunity versus a qualified opportunity, right? Data structure is more naming and making sure where am I measuring. Whereas data model tells me, oh, I'm having stages such as lead development and lead creation. And so if I look at the data structure, we can fix that. If I have the data, we can establish a standardized model, literally hang a poster on the wall and let everybody look at it and go like, okay, here's how we're going to call it. Other than that being a feisty conversation for a little while, but once that is done and everybody adheres to that, it creates an enormous clarity, right? The absence of data, honestly, we don't run that in a lot these days. What we commonly have is that the data is distributed across a whole bunch of different applications and that people are not centralizing that data. That simply is an immaturity of an organization that often needs to be solved by hiring a person that's responsible for that. That person in a hyper-growth company is often not prioritized versus a revenue-generating salesperson. However, with AI replacing headcount quicker and quicker, we are starting to see that person now, we are experiencing that is getting better. Now, looking forward, I want to establish the following. I want to make sure that we look at GTM engineering, which is a role that is currently popular, and that we are not seeing that as the next form of sales hacking. And that is a threat that we see in the market. What do I mean with data structure and a role that we play in hire? We want to see a proper data structure, or somebody hired from a school that has done this and that will establish that will look at the Bowtie, read the revenue architecture book and goes like, this is common sense. What is this is not that hard, right? But whose job it is to do that and who has done this before. And I'm just very cautious that today we have a new trend in calling people an engineer without ever having engineered anything, and therefore not being familiar with the process of engineering.
Right. And then I guess that brings to the next question of, how who does this sit with, this kind of transition into being more purposeful in what we're trying to do and adopting the bow tie?
I see Bertha literally looking at me like, yeah, answer that question, right? like
How? Yeah, help us evangelize this internally.
Like that's exactly. So, the first thing that we need to make sure, folks, this is the CEO's responsibility.
Yes.
Right? Like
say it one more time. One more time, nice and loud.
Thank you.
This is the CEO's responsibility. It's the same way that the CEO's responsibility is that the company has a proper work culture and that it's proper diversified and so on and so forth. Doesn't mean that the CEO wakes up every morning and that is the first thing they think about, but it means that they assign a person to that role, hire that person, and make sure that the proper hiring process was followed in order to get the most qualified person in place. So it is the CEO's responsibility to put that person in place. And that involves for data structure, that involves for GTM architecture, and so on and so forth. Once the CEO recognizes that and responds to that, the natural question is, okay, what is the requirements, right? Like why should we have a person XYZ? And the answer to that historically has been because that person has done the job before. The problem when we look at when people have done the job before, and make sure, I will say this at the beginning, in the middle, and the end, the fact that somebody has job experience is not necessarily a negative thing, okay? That is what we should be looking for. But on its own, it doesn't carry enough merit.
Right.
Because what we see that people who have done the job before, if they have done the job before without properly structuring it, and they've always winged it, then they are very much familiar with what we call a process of reasoning by analogy. Reasoning by analogy is based on what worked in the past will work in the future. And you go slowly, but you make small modifications to it. What we are currently dealing with is a complete redesign of the first principles of growth. We are have to go back all the way to the foundation of where growth comes from and rebuild. What we see with revenue architecture is that these models are based on proper first principles. Where does growth come from? What are the processes and what are the frameworks used for that? What is the data structure for that? And once you do that and you go back to that foundation, you can with relatively ease rebuild where the future is going. If a person has in the past said like, oh, I always deploy ICP and then I go target, like launch an ABM campaign and so on, that is valuable information. But the argument is targeting the right approach right now? Is targeting the right company not too slow? If a person says, I'm going to grow based on hiring more salespeople, right? I've always done that. That is very likely the right solution, but that is not guaranteed to be the right solution. Because hiring people, 3 to 6 months, training people, another 6 months. That means that my growth essentially is delayed by 1 to 2 years. We currently see companies growing from $1 to $10 million in a year. That means that, now, I'm not saying that we should stop hiring people. I'm just saying is like, you should make sure that you have the ability to follow the velocity of the market. And if the market is moving faster and windows of opportunity opening up, you have to be able to jump in on that. And if you primarily rely on a human-based system where you hire salespeople, you cannot jump in on an opportunity that opens 6 months from now, because by the time you got the job rec approved by finance and everybody else, your competitor in today's market is already on it.
And you also have to think the cost, the CAC, right? The more people, and you talked previously about, the more human touches, the less your efficiency, less.
It's so true, yeah. But it, and although your cost and the focus is right, because we have lost so much. Now, if you're at $0 million, your client acquisition cost is infinite, right? Because you're flying around everywhere, and so your client acquisition cost is a function of how you mature. And again, within a framework, we say up to $1 million, folks. You may spend $6 in order to acquire $1. That is kind of like common. That's the reason why you take on venture capital. But at $10 million, we probably want to see that lower. And more importantly, we want to see that you are starting to get a control of what the acquisition cost is with a line that trends downward and that you can determine how far you want to make it go downward. Now, at $100 million, I probably want to see you to be around $2 per acquired dollars. And at $150 million, I want you to start dropping down, right? To be on a trajectory to hit within a certain time frame, $1, $1.25. And I can, I'll skip it today, but I can give you an explanation why that is needed, right? So that gives me the cost picture. But more importantly than that is like, look, cost is important, but the number one reason why VCs put money inside the company is to grow. And that growth needs to occur at an exponential pace, right? And the term triple, double, from 1 to 3 is triple, from 3 to 9 is triple, and then you go, as Agarwal once famously said, that follows an exponential growth curve. Human beings don't scale exponentially. It is a fundamental misunderstanding that with a human, I can scale exponentially. I can't. If I want to dig a hole with a shovel and I need to make the hole twice as big, it's going to take me either twice as much time or twice as many people. It's linear. And if I want to dig a hole 4 times as big, I'm not only going to need 4 times as many people, those 4 people actually talk, so I'm about to need 5 or 6 times as many people, right, in order to scale the hole. So essentially, human beings scale linear. Now, if I want to create an exponential growth curve, simple input-output stuff, simple factory stuff, right? If I want to create an exponential output with a linear-based resource, I got to bring in the exponential volume of resource. So now I'm hiring people exponentially. So I'm going from 1 to 100 people in like 2-3 years, which is the traditional approach to growth. And if you want to say is like, hey, how traditional is this? Well, look at the Salesforce towers that they're building. They're building floor after floor after floor. And in some of my talks, I demonstrate a time lapse of that building growing. And I go like, every floor is supposed to be filled by 200 to 300 people. That's why Salesforce Tower, which was, the design started in about 2012-13, was built that way. But today, we can no longer scale on an exponential growth amount of people because that carries a high cost and it takes too slow. Yeah. So now what I can see is like the design requirements, right? What we said earlier, winning by design, growing by design. The design requirements have changed and now we got to change the way how we build those companies. That doesn't mean that it is, oh my gosh, look at how quick cursor is growing and that is all. No, we can analyze that why that is and we can apply those same patterns to the next company and to the next company, right? That is what we're trying to accomplish with a form of design and revenue architecture.
And if I can add something also that, if you start adding a lot of input, a lot of people into your system before the system has proven to work, then you can start scaling what's not working.
Yeah, and that is essentially what we've seen because, Bertha, what we did by analogy, somebody went to a conference, listened to somebody else on stage, who said, like, this is how I did it. And we go like, well, if that's how that person did it, maybe I should do that too. Went back home. And then that was the design phase, right? The design phase was going to a conference where they listened to a person who said that, right? And look, and I've seen many of these folks that go on stage, right? They come to winning by design and I go like, well, whatever you presented on stage, is not then really the case of what you just explained. No, that's just for the event. I go like, yeah, but there's an audience. Yeah. And often, and I forgot who said it, a person way smarter than us, said at one point in time, when you listen to a person on stage today at many of the conferences, it is just a person who's rattling off the numbers they won the lottery with. And I felt that is actually quite an accurate description, right?
It's interesting.
Like, I don't see, what a company like Winning by Design does is we look at the architecture. We make sure that it is foundationally sound. That doesn't mean it's perfect. All I want to know is if it breaks, where did it break and how did it break? And let's fix that. And then something else breaks. Okay, now we'll fix that. And that allows us to, over time, create a very reliable system. If you're constantly shooting from the hip, hiring people who've done this before and are reasoning by analogy, then you kind of like never get that under full control.
Interesting. No, I think that's a really good point. And we want to, it's that scalable part. And I think that I heard once the difference between sort of scaling and growing. In scale, grow, but that was the growth at all costs. Grow also means spend. And then scaling is that the spend starts to plateau and then you keep revenue growth. And that's kind of what we're trying to achieve, right?
We think in 3 stages of growth. So scalable growth means the more I add, the more my output is. Now, that doesn't need to be linear. It can have a curve that provides less output, right? And so like in the beginning, I double my inputs, I double my outputs. Brand new market, brand new thing, but after a while, that shows diminishing returns, right? I quadruple my inputs and I only get 2x. And then I like quadruple my inputs, I only get 1.1x, right? Now, in order to do that, if I quadruple my inputs, the cost of the inputs generally has a tendency also then to increase, right? But if my inputs no longer work, then my cost of the throughput start to increase. I need to hire better salespeople, higher prices, or I need to, right? So cost becomes becomes a function. But really when we call that scalable growth. That's the first stage of maturity. And almost every company has not left this stage of maturity. There's about 10 public SaaS companies who have left the stage of this stage. We track about 70 to 80 public SaaS companies on a quarterly basis. And so the remaining, other than those 10, are only in scalable. The next one, the 10, have moved on to sustainable. Sustainable means that what I pay for the that there's control of the cost. I can manipulate it as I see fit. And if I want to, the company can fly quite a while. For us, sustainable means, in general, that you have an LTV anywhere of 5+ years and a cost of acquisition less than $2.
Okay.
Now, the best companies in the world, you can literally look it up. Benchsites, Dave Spitz at Benchsites publish it. They operate, and these are all the company names that you know. Like if you think about Snowflake, and if you think about Palantir, if you think of all the really good companies, they all operate somewhere between 75 cents to acquire $1 and $1.25. It's not like a magic thing. It's not like it's something that anybody can do, but not. If you don't focus on it, you don't. But that's the second, right? So first stage, scalable. I change my input. The second stage is sustainable. I can control my cost. The third stage is durable. And in the durable stage, you become dependent on growth from your existing customers. Your customers are achieving such great success rate that they're renewing themselves, and that the price as you are increasing the price because the value of your product goes up, your retention stays relatively high. But most important of all, in the durable stage, your customers generate pipeline for you. They become a critical element of your go-to-market process. And this is what only very few companies have, like the fewest of the fewest. Now, if I think about like who are those are the famous brands like Apple and Amazon, and Netflix. They are all they're in the durable stage. People talk so much about them, they generate their own pipeline, right? And that is those 3 stages, forms 3 stages of maturity. What we see, look, at $100 million, we're asking companies to become sustainable. And at $1 billion, we ask companies to become durable. And today, most aren't. Most companies at $1 billion are not even sustainable, let alone be durable.
And it's almost, I know at least working in an in-house, we look at Apple, we're like, that's what we're going to do. But we're, 30 people in, Copenhagen, things like that. And I think we miss those stages. We hope to skip straight to durable before we go through almost like the learning curve and the growing pains of that S curve, right? We panic at the S curve, the drop. As soon as the drop happens, there's sort of a panic. And I think, what kind of advice would you give to people to embrace the S curve, to know the dip is good because the dip's coming up? Or, how do we deal with that when we live with a grow at all costs, we need to keep growing?
The right way of looking at this is as follows.
It was bound to happen.
The right thing of looking at this is as follows. Your success is not being measured whether the drop or whether it drops or increases. You have to understand that failure and is a learning lesson. What your maturity is measured in is your data accurate and does it reflect? And can you go back to the data, see what happened, learn from it, and improve on the next go around? And we prefer that next go around not to be the next company, whether that is for an executive being fired or whether that is for the company going bankrupt and the founder trying again. And at a success rate of well below 2%, it tells you what today's market is like, and trending down to make it worse.
Wow. Okay. Is it all doom and gloom?
It is not all doom and gloom. I actually think that what we are seeing if I go back and I say 5 years ago, before the SaaS crash, so I'm talking like 2018, 19, 20 timeframe, and I would say it's like, okay, and we're on the growth at all cost mindset, and everybody's thinking about this, and money is cheap, and so on. And I would then say, is okay, will people tend to look at revenue architecture? No, it's too complex. We just, hire more salespeople, right? Get more money, get more salespeople. If I then say, is like, what would be needed for our world to take on a modern future of growth, then what would be needed is, well, we probably need a crash of the entire SaaS market. Well, that's never going to happen. Well, that just happened in 2022. And then what I would say is like, okay, well, we probably need a disruptive technology that can offset the cost, because, we're going to be too addicted to humans, right? Okay, well, what is the likelihood that that's going to happen? Okay, well, that just happened. And so it is only very logical that under this, like the next step is that companies simply start taking data-centric approach, revenue architecture-centric approach, and a grow by design approach is only logical at this point.
Brilliant. We're sort of nearing the end. That was a strong end, but I'm going to give you one last chance if there's anything else you want to leave our listeners with before we say goodbye.
I think that, look, I give this advice often, but I don't want, it has only gotten way, way, way more important over these past years. What I learned, if you go back to the days of watching movies like that I grew up with, such as Back to the Future, it represented a future in which cars could fly and you had hoverboards and so on. But if you think about like many of the sci-fi movies, they always predicted this particular future. And when I looked at this particular future, you look at things and you go like, hey, they actually have become quite true. Like if you see things such as iPads were already depicted in movies long before they became a reality. That means that sci-fi is quite an accurate reflection can be quite an accurate reflection of what the future looks like. What I learned from that is this. We human beings are very capable of predicting our future in forms and shapes and what the future will look like. Whether that is sometimes dramatic or whether that is, like technology-wise fantastic. What we have a hard time in is predicting the accuracy in time. So we're off on time. The hoverboard should have already been there and we're not there yet. What I believe that today, what suits the listener today, if you are listening to this, here's what I recommend that you do. Go write out what you think your business will look like 10 years from now. And I believe that you can get a pretty decent, if you're into this market and you know your customer really well, and you know what your problem you're solving, you get a pretty decent idea on what it looks like in the next 10 years. And then I want you to anticipate that is what it will look like in 18 months. And I believe you're going to be more right than wrong.
Wow. Boom. What an end. Jacco, thank you so much. This has been incredibly insightful, and I can't wait to listen to it back and actually take notes properly so I can implement some of these insights. Anything else before we say goodbye?
I have been muted throughout the whole session because I have nothing more to add.
Brilliant. Jacco, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure and a treat.
Lovely.